Hello YouTube, welcome to Cooking with Dad. Today I am going to show you a basic pizza recipe. If you follow my instructions, this should be one of the best pizzas that you've ever made in your life. Now, I can talk from experience because I used to own a pizza shop many years ago. So, let's get started. I'm going to start out with the dough, and I start with a cup and a quarter of warm tap water. Warm, not hot. And I put it into my bread machine bowl, and from there I'm going to use standard bread machine yeast. Now you can use any type of yeast you want, but this is what I prefer. It's easiest. It's always worked well for me. I'm going to use about 1.5 tablespoons of bread machine yeast, and I just kind of eyeball it in the palm of my hand. Spread it into the water. Now the yeast needs something to feed off of, so you put about 2 tablespoons of sugar into that mix. It gets the yeast activated. Now, most pizza dough recipes call for oil, either vegetable oil or olive oil. I have found in my experience that if you use butter, replace the oil with the butter, and you use about 2 tablespoons of butter. You can use salted or unsalted, whichever you like. And you just put that in the mix. And you'll find out if you do it this way, you'll get the most fluffiest dough. Believe me, you won't be disappointed. From that, I add the flour, and I just use standard flour from Walmart, nothing fancy. And I use about 3.5 cups of flour. I like to make a mess. You know what they say about messy cooks, don't you? That they're the best. Okay, that's 2. Three and a half. Now, in case you're wondering, you noticed I didn't add the salt in the liquid mix. The reason I do that is because if you add the salt to the liquid mix with the yeast, the salt will have a tendency to stagnate the yeast. So if you put the salt in on top of the flour, by the time the yeast combined with the water has a chance to work and generate. The salt hasn't reached the liquid yet. So I put about a teaspoon and a half of kosher salt. I like kosher salt because it gives it a better flavor, in my opinion. Put the bowl into the bread machine. And I just use a French bread setting. Now I can tell you that this same recipe is very good to use for if you're baking bread or any type of dough recipe. Rolls, whichever, you name it. Okay, I'm going to start my bread machine. Now that'll go through its cycle and mix, and then the bread machine will act as a rising bin, and it'll heat up and it'll let the dough rise for about an hour, hour and a half. And after it rises, then we'll take the dough out, and you'll see what I do with it then. But in the meantime, I'm going to show you how to make the sauce. Let me clean up here for a second, just so I don't have such a mess. Okay, now with the sauce, let me prop you up here a little bit. Now with my sauce, I grow my own tomatoes, and I can my own tomatoes. And now, if you grow your own tomatoes, that's fine, use them. But if you don't have the access to your own tomatoes, make sure you buy whole tomatoes in a can at the store. Now let me get a jar out here. See there? These are tomatoes that I grew. Now, if you're going to make pizza, you don't have to use the dough machine to mix your dough. You can mix it by hand. It just takes longer. You know, there's more work to it. But you'll mix it up and you'll let it rise for about an hour, hour and a half, covered in a pan. And you want it to double in size. And we'll go back to that. I'll talk more about that. But let's start the sauce. I use a food processor. And I just take my whole jar of tomatoes, liquid and all. You don't have to strain them. Did you hear that seal break? That means they were canned properly. Now, if you're buying the tomatoes in the store in the can, minimum you want to get 15-ounce cans per pizza. So if you're making a large pizza or two pizzas, you want two 15-ounce cans. So let me get my spices organized here. Now I'm going to tell you my recipe. And you can follow it. I just dropped stuff. You can follow what I do with my recipe. Or you can make your own recipe. But I'll tell you what, if you try it this way, you're not going to be disappointed. You'll have this recipe for the rest of your life. And this same recipe I used when I had my pizza shop. It was actually a pizza / Italian restaurant. My bread machine's going to start carrying on. Okay, so what I start with oregano, and I put about 1.5 teaspoons oregano in. And I eyeball everything, but you know, if you want to measure everything out, that's fine, go for it. I've been doing it for so long, I actually have an idea of what I need. So there's about 1.5 teaspoons oregano. I just do a shake of tarragon, just a shake. I do about 1/4 teaspoon of onion powder. Now this same recipe for sauce you can use for spaghetti, lasagna, anything you choose. I use about 1.5 teaspoons of basil. And a shake of thyme, just about 1/4 teaspoon. A splash of lemon juice, just a splash. I almost forgot the garlic powder. Now you can use fresh whole garlic. I find that the garlic powder for this recipe works just as well. If you want to get picky about it, go for the fresh garlic. I use about 1/2 teaspoon of garlic powder. Then salt and pepper to taste. Be warned, don't use a lot of pepper because it will overpower the other spices. So you want to use about 1/4 teaspoon of pepper. And I have low salt tolerance, so I don't use a lot of salt. So about the same, 1/4 teaspoon of salt. And since I can grow my own tomatoes, this is something I always do. This kind of thickens the sauce. I always put a 6-ounce can of tomato paste in the mix. maybe open it up. Now you can understand why I use my bread machine. The machine does all the work for me. Otherwise, I'd be sitting here kneading and pounding and stretching. So save yourself as much work as you can, wherever possible. Believe me, it's not cheating. It's beneficial. So from there, I mix up the sauce. It doesn't take a lot. Just a few pulses. Hey, see how nice it turned out? Look at that. That's good. Now from here, what I do, let me walk you over here to the stove. Now keep in mind, I'm preparing all this stuff in advance, okay? And I recommend that if you're going to do this, you prepare everything in advance, at least 2 hours in advance, to get it all working. The dough, the sauce. So from here, I am going to dump everything into a pan, a saucepan. Now the last thing I do is I put in 1 bay leaf into the pan. Don't crush it up or anything, just put the whole bay leaf in. And then I'm going to turn that pan on low, simmer, and I'm going to let it simmer for about 20 minutes to half an hour. What that does, the heat incorporates all the spices into the sauce. I hope you can hear me all right with this machine running. On low. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to let this machine go through its cycle, and I'm going to let it rise, and when it's ready to come out of the machine, I'll bring it back. Okay?